I would like to show you how to replace a snare drum or any other drum track like a kick drum or tom-tom track with the SPL DrumXchanger. So let me show you the session that I'm working on at the moment. And then of course, solo the snare drum track that I'm talking about so you can listen to it and hear what it sounds like in the original version. I'm going to open the edit window of Pro Tools and have a look at the snare drum track there. Now the first thing I'm going to do, of course, is open the DrumXchanger. Now when you open the DrumXchanger plugin, you'll immediately see that no drum kit has been loaded and all the controls are set to a certain default position. That default position is set so that you can easily sample or replace a snare drum. So if you have an ordinary snare drum track and you open the DrumXchanger and you load up a kit, it should immediately be able to replace most of the hits, if not all. Now the first thing you want to do is load up a kit. So you should go into the sample section and press on load and select the kit you want to load into the DrumXchanger. So in this case, I'm going to load a snare drum sample and open it. There you go. Now the 4 buttons above the red drum kit are banks. I have not just loaded a snare drum. I have loaded an entire SPL drum kit, and not only 1, but 4, and I can switch between them on the fly. So here's bank number 2, and bank number 3, and of course number 4. The picture of the drum kit below represents all the individual kit pieces of every set, and I can switch between those on the fly as well. So I have a snare drum, or I can load up a kick drum, or a number of tom-toms. But for now, we're going to go with the snare drum. Now, what you should do first is select a part of the snare drum track that contains snare drum in all articulations and all ways of playing that represent what you want to replace in the song. You can then loop that part so you have continuous playback while you're adjusting the DrumXchanger. So let's listen to that and start replacing. Now, I am going to use the input gain control to determine the input level of the original sound and adjust the signal's volume. And don't worry, these adjustments have no influence whatsoever on the recognition and the level of the trigger. Sometimes an input signal comes in too hot, which is then indicated by the overload LED. That overload LED is post-input gain, so it indicates not only if the signal is too hot, but also if the overloading is taking place after the input gain. Now, the next stop is the original section. You can activate solo on the original module, so you will listen only to the original signal. This will allow you to concentrate on that specific signal and make all necessary adjustments. The first 2 controls on the top are the high and the low pass filters. These filters allow you to cut the low or high end of the original signal to focus on a narrower frequency range. These settings, however, have no influence whatsoever on the sound recognition or the trigger module, so they don't affect the sound of the sample. Now, typical uses of these filters include filtering of rumble and low-frequency interferences with the high-pass filter and the suppression of hi-hat crosstalk with a low-pass filter. With the transient designer below, you can shape the original sound. You can add a tack, take a tack away, and do the same with the sustain. You can add some or take some away. Let's have a quick listen. Now I'm adding a tack, and of course taking a tack away. Now since I really want to replace the original signal as much as I can, I don't really need to play around with the transient designer this time. But what would be interesting for you to know is the trigger button. Now when the trigger button is activated, the transient designer processor of the original module also affects the trigger module. And that can be very useful when drum sounds are too resonant and therefore not easily recognizable or distinguishable. This usually affects toms and bass drums rather than snares. Now the ducking feature below reduces the level of the original signal for a moment. The timing of the ducking is preset and cannot be modified. Attack is set to 1 millisecond and release to 10 milliseconds. So level reduction takes place for a very short time only. Overall, the ducking can be set from 0 dB to minus 40 dB. So the higher the ducking value, the more of the original signal is overshadowed by the sample. So if I was to turn the ducking control down, you would immediately hear how the original sound is compressed. I'm going to bring it down all the way for you to hear. Of course, this is a very extreme setting which we won't be needing for this example, so I'm going to bring it to a setting where I like it. Now let's unsolo the original section and then move over to the next section, which is the trigger section, and solo that so we can hear better what we're doing with the trigger signal. Soloing this section will allow you to set the frequency and the bandwidth parameters as precisely as possible, but also to check for all other module parameters and optimize them. Now, the first two controls on the trigger module are the frequency and the bandwidth or Q controls. In most cases, you can actually set these controls by ear. Now, the precision and the speed at which sound is recognized depends a lot on these two controls. You can set the frequency as close as possible to the drum's fundamental frequency and define the bandwidth as precisely as possible. And to make fine adjustments, always use the solo function. It helps you a lot to hear what you're doing. Now I'm going to bring up the Q value to narrow the bandwidth and then search for the best frequency for my trigger signal. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the default of the DrumXchanger is set for snare drum, so I don't have to do a whole lot here.